They say life can change in an instant. For me, that instant came on an unremarkable day in a cold, fluorescent-lit doctor's office. It was the moment my perfect, dependable world shattered into pieces. I wasn't the kind of man who ever doubted his family. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for more than 3 decades. We had 3 kids, Kevin, Samantha, and Rachel. I wasn't the richest guy in town, but I worked hard to provide for them, running a service station I'd built from the ground up. Life wasn't perfect, but I always thought it was solid. That was before I learned that everything I thought I knew was a lie. It started with Kevin. Kevin, my oldest, was 28. He was the kind of son any father would be proud of, hardworking, devoted to his wife and kids, and a great man all around. That's why it hit me so hard when he started feeling sick. At first, it seemed like nothing, just some fatigue and an upset stomach. But when he collapsed in his garage one afternoon, I knew something was seriously wrong. Emily and I drove him to the hospital that day, white-knuckling the steering wheel the entire way. I remember sitting in that waiting room, watching Emily pace back and forth, mumbling prayers under her breath. Kevin's wife, Grace, sat with her head in her hands, barely holding herself together. After what felt like hours, the doctor finally came out. He wore that expression doctors use when they're about to drop bad news. "Mr. and Mrs. Adams," he said, motioning for us to follow him into a private room. Emily grabbed my arm, and I could feel her nails dig into my skin. The doctor sat down and started explaining that Kevin had a kidney condition, serious enough that if treatment didn't work, he'd need a transplant. I didn't hesitate for a second. "I'll do it," I said firmly. "If he needs a kidney, he's getting mine." The doctor nodded and started explaining the process. Tests, compatibility checks, all the usual steps. It sounded simple enough. Kevin was my son. Of course, I'd be a match. But when the results came back, everything changed. I'll never forget the doctor's face when he called me into his office the next day. "Mr. Adams," he began, glancing down at the papers in his hand, "your test results are unexpected. You're not a match for Kevin." "What do you mean I'm not a match?" I snapped. The doctor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Well, biologically speaking, you and Kevin aren't compatible." "That's impossible," I said, my voice rising. "He's my son." The doctor held up a hand. "It's rare, but mistakes can happen in labs. We're running the test again to confirm." I stormed out of the office, my head spinning. A mistake? It had to be. There was no way Kevin wasn't my son. I'd raised him. I'd seen him take his first steps, taught him how to throw a football, and been there for every important moment in his life. When I got home that night, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through the mail. She looked up when I walked in, her smile fading when she saw my face. "Matt, what's wrong?" "Nothing," I lied. "The doctor just said they need to run some more tests." Her brow furrowed. "More tests? Why?" "They said something didn't match up," I said carefully. "Probably a lab error." She nodded slowly, but didn't press further. For the next few days, I watched her closely. Every glance, every movement, every hesitation. Was she hiding something? When the hospital called to confirm the results, my worst fears were realized. "Mr. Adams, the retest confirmed the findings. You're not a biological match for Kevin." I hung up the phone without saying a word. My hands were shaking, but I wasn't just afraid. I was angry, furious. That evening, I sat in the den, staring at the wall. Kevin wasn't my son. Those words kept bouncing around in my head, no matter how hard I tried to push them away. And if Kevin wasn't mine, what about Samantha? What about Rachel? I needed answers. The next morning, I approached Emily with a plan. I kept my tone calm, casual. "With everything going on with Kevin, I think it might be a good idea for all of us to get genetic testing done," I said over breakfast. Emily froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Genetic testing? For what?" "Just a precaution," I said. "In case something like this ever happens again, it'll give the doctors a baseline." She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I guess that makes sense." Rachel and Samantha didn't ask any questions. They agreed right away, trusting me without a second thought. But Emily's hesitation stuck in my mind. The samples were sent off, and a week later, the results arrived. I opened the envelope in the quiet of my office, my hands trembling as I unfolded the papers. Kevin Adams, no biological match. Samantha Adams, no biological match. Rachel Adams, biological match. I stared at the results, my vision blurring with rage. Kevin and Samantha weren't mine. I slammed the papers down on the desk, my chest heaving with every breath. My hands curled into fists as a wave of betrayal washed over me. How could this happen? How could Emily lie to me for so many years? When she came home that evening, I was waiting for her. "Matt," she said cautiously, seeing the look on my face. "What's wrong?" I didn't say a word. I pulled the envelope from my pocket and slapped it onto the table in front of her. "Explain this," I said, my voice cold and sharp. Her eyes widened as she picked up the papers. Her hands shook as she read them, her face going pale. "Matt, How long, Emily?" I barked. "How long have you been lying to me?" "Matt, please, I can explain. I don't want excuses," I shouted, slamming my hand on the table. "I want the truth. Now." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the papers. "It was a mistake. A long time ago. I didn't mean for this to happen. Don't you dare try to downplay this," I growled. "You betrayed me. You lied to me for over 30 years, and now you expect me to just sit here and listen to excuses?" "I never wanted to hurt you," she sobbed. "Well, you did, Emily. You hurt me, and you lied to our kids. To Kevin. To Samantha. How am I supposed to look them in the eye now, knowing the truth?" Her silence was all the confirmation I needed. I stood there for a long moment, my fists clenched and my jaw tight. Then I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night. The house was dark, and the silence was almost suffocating. I sat in my den, staring at the DNA results that had upended my entire world. Kevin and Samantha weren't mine. Rachel was the only one who carried my blood. The anger simmered under my skin, sharp and relentless. 30 years. For 30 damn years, Emily had lied to me. I had poured my heart and soul into raising those kids, only to find out they weren't mine. The next morning, I decided I needed more answers, complete answers. Emily's vague excuses from the night before weren't enough. I wanted to know everything, and this time, I wasn't going to let her cry her way out of it. When I walked into the kitchen, she was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in her hands. She looked like she hadn't slept either. "We need to talk," I said, my voice hard and cold. Her head shot up, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Matt, please." "No more excuses," I snapped, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting down. I placed the results on the table between us. "I want the truth. All of it. Right now." She stared at the papers, her hands trembling. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "Oh, it's not?" I said, leaning forward. "Then tell me, Emily. Tell me why Kevin and Samantha aren't my kids. Tell me why you lied to me for 30 years. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't about to let her play the victim. I was young, Matt," she began. "I was confused. I made mistakes." "Cut the crap," I interrupted. "Start at the beginning. Who was it?" Her face crumpled as she buried her head in her hands. "It was Chris," she whispered. I froze. "Chris Turner?" She nodded, her shoulders shaking. "It was a long time ago, Matt. Before you, and I had even been married a year. Chris had been one of my closest friends back then. He and his wife, Lisa, had been practically family. We'd spent weekends together, barbecues, holidays. I trusted him, and I trusted her." "How long?" I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. Her answer was barely audible. 5 years. The words hit me like a gut punch. 5 years. 5 years of lies, of betrayal, of smiling in my face while sneaking around behind my back. "So, Kevin and Samantha," I couldn't even finish the sentence. "They're his," she admitted, her voice breaking. I pushed my chair back abruptly, the sound screeching against the tile floor. I paced the kitchen, running a hand through my hair as the rage bubbled to the surface. "For 5 years, you were sleeping with Chris," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "For 5 years, you lied to me. You had his children, and you let me believe they were mine." "I didn't mean for it to happen," she sobbed. "It just Don't you dare say it just happened. I snarled, slamming my hand on the table. You made a choice, Emily. Every single time, you made a choice. She flinched but didn't say anything. Why? I demanded. What was it, huh? Was I not good enough for you? Was I just some backup plan? No, she cried. I loved you, Matt. I still love you. It wasn't like that. Then explain it to me, I said, my voice laced with venom. Explain to me how you could love me and betray me at the same time. She wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath. Chris and I, we had history. Before you and I met, I was in love with him. But he married Lisa, and I was heartbroken. When you came along, you were so kind, so steady. I thought I could move on with you. But then Chris, he started coming around again, saying he made a mistake, that he wanted to be with me. I got caught up in it. I was stupid. I was weak. I stared at her, my jaw tight. Weak doesn't even begin to cover it, I said coldly. It ended when Kevin was born, she continued, her voice trembling. Chris came to see him and asked if he was the father. I told him I didn't know, but he laughed and said it didn't matter because I was already married to you. That's when I realized he never cared about me. He just wanted control. Don't try to make yourself the victim, I said sharply. You could have told me. You could have stopped it at any time, but you didn't. You kept it going, and you let me raise his kids. Her silence said everything I needed to know. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt, I was scared. I thought I'd lose you. And after Chris died, I thought, what's the point in bringing it up? We had a good life, didn't we? I laughed bitterly. A good life? Built on lies? Do you even hear yourself right now? Please, Matt, she begged, tears streaming down her face. Don't do this. Don't throw away everything we've built because of mistakes I made decades ago. I shook my head, disgusted. You didn't just betray me, Emily. You betrayed Kevin and Samantha. They don't even know who their real father is. Do you even care what this will do to them? Of course I care, she said desperately. That's why we have to keep this between us. Please, Matt, don't tell them. It'll destroy them. I stood there, staring at her. Part of me wanted to throw her lies back in her face, to tell Kevin and Samantha the truth, and let the chips fall where they may. But as angry as I was, I couldn't bring myself to hurt them. They didn't deserve this. I'm done, I said finally. We're done. Her face crumpled, and she shook her head. Matt, no. Please don't do this. We can fix this. I love you. I laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the kitchen. You don't love me, Emily. You love the life I gave you. But that life is over. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, her sobs trailing behind me. For the next few days, we barely spoke. I moved into the guest room, and the house felt like a battlefield. Every glance, every word was heavy with unspoken anger and regret. Then 3 days later, I got the call. Mr. Adams, this is Deputy Collins. There's been an accident. Emily's car had gone off the road, crashing into a guardrail before tumbling down an embankment. They said she'd been speeding, going too fast to make the turn. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Guilt? Relief? Her death left a gaping hole in my chest, but it didn't erase the betrayal. At the funeral, I kept my composure. Kevin and Samantha didn't need to know the truth. As far as they were concerned, Emily had been a loving mother and wife. Let them have that. But as I stood over her grave, I couldn't stop the question from running through my mind. Had it really been an accident? Or had she decided that living with the truth was too much to bear? The first week after Emily's funeral felt like I was trapped in a fog. Her death had brought a strange kind of silence to the house, one that felt heavier than I could have ever imagined. But as much as I hated to admit it, part of me was relieved. Relieved that I wouldn't have to face her in the hallways or sit across from her at the kitchen table pretending everything was fine. The kids, of course, were devastated. Kevin and Samantha were inconsolable, clinging to their memories of Emily as the loving mother they'd always known. Rachel had always been closer to me, and she spent her time trying to comfort me, though she didn't know the half of what had happened. For their sake, I kept the truth to myself. Emily's lies, her betrayal, it would stay buried with her. There was no point in tearing apart their image of her. They didn't need to know the ugly reality of the woman I had spent 30 years with. But the truth was, I didn't know how to move forward. 30 years of my life had been built on lies, and I was left standing in the rubble trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. For weeks, I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the service station to avoid going home to the empty house. It was better than sitting in the silence, surrounded by the ghosts of my past. Then one day, as I was sitting at my desk, staring at an invoice I had no intention of paying attention to, I saw something on TV that made me pause. It was one of those commercials, the kind that asks you to sponsor a child in need. The narrator's voice droned on about how a small monthly donation could feed a child, clothe them, send them to school. All the things I had done for Kevin and Samantha, believing they were my own. I felt a pang of anger. But then something shifted. Those kids on the screen weren't responsible for the lies I'd been told. They weren't to blame for anything. The next day, I walked into St. Mark's Church. It wasn't the first place you'd expect to find me. I hadn't set foot in a church since Emily and I got married, and even then, it was mostly for appearances. But that day, I needed something, some sense of purpose, some way to feel like my life wasn't just wasted years. Pastor Jim greeted me with a warm smile. He was a kind man in his 60s, someone who seemed to know everyone in town. "Matt Adams," he said, shaking my hand. "What brings you here today?" "I heard you run one of those Christmas programs," I said. "The kind where you help families in need?" Jim nodded. "We do. We've got a tree set up with the names of families who could use some extra help this holiday season. Would you like to sponsor someone?" "Not just sponsor," I said firmly. "I want to do something real. Not just buy a gift and call it a day. I want to make a difference." Jim studied me for a moment, then smiled. "I think I've got just the family for you." That's how I met Rebecca Wilson. Rebecca was a young widow with 3 kids, Michael, Mark, and little Molly. Her husband had been killed in a robbery gone wrong, and she had moved to our town to start fresh, but life hadn't been kind to her. She worked long hours as a waitress at Joe's Diner, barely scraping by. The first time I met her, she was behind the counter, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, a tired but genuine smile on her face. "Can I help you?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "I think it's the other way around," I said. "I'm Matt. Pastor Jim told me about you." Her smile faltered for a moment, and I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't used to accepting help. "I'm not looking for charity," she said quickly. "This isn't charity," I replied. "Think of it as a holiday friendship. I just want to help make this season a little easier for you and your kids." Rebecca hesitated, but eventually nodded. "All right," she said. "Thank you." That first visit was short, just enough time to introduce myself and promise to come by again soon. Over the next few weeks, I started stopping by Joe's Diner regularly, leaving bigger tips than I probably should have, and chatting with Rebecca whenever she had a moment to spare. Her kids warmed up to me quickly, especially Molly. She was 4 years old, with big brown eyes and a laugh that could light up a room. Michael and Mark, 8 and 6, were a little more cautious, but they came around once I started bringing them small gifts, books, puzzles, little things to keep them entertained. It felt good to help them. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a purpose again. But life is a way of throwing curveballs. One evening, Rebecca called me, her voice trembling. "Matt, I don't know who else to call. Our apartment was broken into. They took everything, our TV, the kids' toys, even my work shoes. I don't know what to do." "Pack your bags," I said without hesitation. "You and the kids are coming to my house." "Matt, I can't. This isn't up for debate," I interrupted. "You're not staying there another night. Pack your things. I'll be there in 15 minutes. When I arrived, the apartment was a mess. The door had been kicked in, and drawers were pulled out, their contents scattered on the floor. Rebecca was standing in the middle of it all, holding Molly while the boys clung to her legs. "Come on," I said, motioning for them to follow me. I helped them gather what little they had left and loaded it into my truck. By the time we got to my house, the kids were yawning, and Rebecca looked like she was about to collapse from exhaustion. "You can stay as long as you need to," I told her as I showed them to the guest rooms. The next few days were chaotic, but oddly comforting. Rebecca insisted on helping around the house, cooking meals and cleaning even though I told her she didn't have to. The kids started calling me Uncle Matt, and Molly took to climbing into my lap every night before bed to give me a good night kiss on the cheek. It wasn't long before my kids found out about Rebecca and her family. Rachel was the first to meet them, and she took to Rebecca immediately. "She's great, Dad," Rachel said after dinner one evening. "I can see why you want to help her." But Kevin and Samantha weren't as understanding. When they came by for a visit, it didn't take long for the tension to boil over. "Dad, what are you doing?" Kevin asked, his voice tight. "You barely know this woman, and now she's living in your house with her kids?" "She needed help," I said simply. "Help?" Samantha said, raising an eyebrow. "Or are you trying to replace Mom?" Her words cut deeper than I expected, but I kept my composure. "Emily and I had 30 years together," I said. "But she's gone. And this isn't about replacing anyone. It's about doing the right thing." "Just be careful," Kevin said, his tone softening. "I don't want you to get hurt." "I can take care of myself," I replied firmly. Life with Rebecca and her kids wasn't easy at first. Adjusting to a full house again was both overwhelming and surprisingly rewarding. The kids brought energy back into a home that had been suffocatingly quiet after Emily's death. Molly's laughter echoed through the hallways. Michael and Mark found joy in discovering the games and toys I still had from when my own kids were little. And Rebecca, she brought something I hadn't felt in years, hope. But not everyone was thrilled about the changes. Kevin and Samantha were skeptical from the start. They stopped by less often, though Rachel visited frequently, becoming fast friends with Rebecca. It was clear she appreciated the help. But I could see the strain in Rebecca's eyes every time Kevin or Samantha made a thinly veiled comment about her staying in the house. One Sunday afternoon, Kevin and Samantha showed up unannounced. Rebecca and the kids were out, giving me the rare luxury of some quiet time. I should have known the visit wouldn't be a friendly one. "Dad, we need to talk," Kevin said as he stepped into the living room. "All right," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "What's on your mind?" Samantha crossed her arms, her expression tense. "This isn't like you. Letting a woman and her kids move in? You've only known her a few months. Do I need your permission to make decisions in my own house?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "Come on, Dad," Kevin said, raising his hands defensively. "We're just worried about you. This whole thing feels sudden." "Sudden?" I barked. "It's not sudden. It's necessary." Rebecca and her kids didn't have anywhere else to go. What was I supposed to do? Leave them in that broken-down apartment to fend for themselves? "That's not what we're saying," Samantha interjected. "But you barely know her. What if she's just using you? Taking advantage of your generosity?" My fist clenched, but I kept my voice level. "You think I don't know what I'm doing? You think I haven't been around long enough to tell when someone's genuine and when someone's not?" Kevin sighed, sitting down across from me. "It's not about that. We're just trying to protect you. You've been through a lot this past year." I stood, pacing the room to calm my frustration. "Let me make something clear. Rebecca didn't ask to stay here. I offered. And if you think I'm too blind to see what's in front of me, you're wrong." Samantha exchanged a glance with Kevin, her face softening slightly. "Okay, Dad," she said. "We'll drop it. But just promise us you'll be careful." "Careful," I repeated, shaking my head. "I've spent my whole life being careful. This isn't about being cautious. It's about doing what's right." They left not long after, their concerns still hanging in the air. For the first time, I wondered if I'd done the right thing bringing Rebecca into my home. Not because of her, but because of the strain it was putting on my relationships with Kevin and Samantha. That evening, Rebecca returned with the kids, their laughter filling the house once again. Molly ran up to me, her arms outstretched. "Uncle Matt, look what I got." She held up a small stuffed animal, her face beaming with pride. I knelt down, ruffling her hair. "That's a fine-looking bear, Molly. What's his name?" "Charlie," she exclaimed before dashing off to show Michael and Mark. Rebecca watched her go, a soft smile on her face. "She's been so happy since we've been here," she said quietly. I nodded, meeting her gaze. "So have I." The words hung between us for a moment, and I saw something flicker in her expression, something I hadn't seen in years. "Matt, I need to talk to you about something," she said hesitantly. "Go ahead," I said, gesturing for her to sit. "I've been thinking," she began, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I don't want to overstay our welcome. You've already done so much for us, and I don't want to be a burden." You're not a burden, I said firmly. This house was too quiet before you got here. I like having you and the kids around. Her eyes softened, but she shook her head. I still feel like I need to contribute. I want to pay rent or help with the bills. Something to show you how much we appreciate what you've done for us. I hesitated, knowing how proud she was and how much this meant to her. All right, I said finally. We'll figure something out. But don't think for a second that I'll let you overwork yourself trying to pay me back. She smiled, relief washing over her face. Thank you, Matt, for everything. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine. Rebecca started taking on more responsibility around the house, and the kids settled into a rhythm of school and play. The tension with Kevin and Samantha lingered, but I did my best to keep the peace. Then came Thanksgiving. Rebecca insisted on cooking, and Rachel offered to help. I invited Kevin and Samantha, along with their families, hoping the holiday might smooth things over. The dinner was a chaotic but joyful affair. Molly charmed everyone with her endless stories, and even Kevin seemed to relax, joking with Michael and Mark as they played in the living room. But just as I started to think things might finally be settling down, Samantha pulled me aside. "Dad," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "I need to ask you something." "Go ahead," I said, my stomach tightening. Are you planning on marrying Rebecca?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but she cut me off. "I'm not saying it's a bad thing," she added quickly. "I just want to know where your head is. Because if you are, I think you need to tell us." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Samantha, I care about Rebecca. A lot. But I haven't made any decisions yet. I'm taking it one day at a time." She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Okay, just don't forget about us, all right?" "Forget about you?" I said, frowning. "Samantha, you and Kevin and Rachel will always come first. That hasn't changed, and it never will." She gave me a small smile, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. After dinner, as the guests trickled out and the house grew quiet again, Rebecca and I sat together in the living room. The kids were upstairs, worn out from the day's excitement. "Did you have a good time?" I asked. She nodded, her head resting against the back of the couch. "It was wonderful. Thank you for inviting us." I hesitated, unsure how to bring up what Samantha had said. But before I could speak, Rebecca reached over and took my hand. "Matt," she said softly, "I don't know what the future holds, but I just want you to know how much this means to me. To us. You've given us more than I ever could have hoped for." Her words sent a warmth through my chest, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Life after Thanksgiving seemed to settle into a rhythm. Rebecca and the kids were firmly part of the house now, and with each passing day, it felt more like home again. The mornings were lively, with Michael and Mark rushing to get ready for school, while Molly sat at the table, swinging her legs and chattering away about her important kindergarten adventures. Rebecca had taken on more household responsibilities than I expected, despite my insistence that she didn't have to. She kept the house immaculate, cooked dinners that rivaled the ones Emily used to make, and somehow still managed to juggle her job at Joe's Diner. "Rebecca, you don't have to do all this," I told her one evening as she stood in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. She looked up, a small smile on her face. "I want to. You've done so much for us, Matt. It's the least I can do." Her gratitude never wavered, and neither did the quiet sense of peace she brought to the house. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't thought possible: contentment. But not everyone was as accepting of the changes. Kevin and Samantha were still cautious. They visited less often now, and when they did, there was always an undercurrent of tension. It wasn't outright hostility, but it was clear they didn't fully trust Rebecca's place in my life, or in the family. One Saturday afternoon, Rachel came over for lunch. She and Rebecca had become close in a way I hadn't anticipated, and their bond seemed to ease some of the unease I'd been feeling. "Dad, I think you should talk to Kevin and Samantha," Rachel said as we sat in the living room, sipping coffee. "I've tried," I said with a sigh. "They think I'm making a mistake." "They're just worried about you," she said gently. "You've been through a lot, and they don't want to see you get hurt." "I'm not some naive kid, Rachel," I replied, a hint of frustration in my voice. "I know what I'm doing. I know you do, she said. But maybe you should tell them that. I nodded, knowing she was right. Later that week, I invited Kevin and Samantha over for dinner. Rebecca offered to cook, and despite my reservations, I agreed. When they arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Kevin greeted Rebecca with a polite but distant nod, while Samantha gave her a tight-lipped smile. Rebecca, ever gracious, welcomed them warmly and spent the evening trying to make them feel at home. She even enlisted the kids to help set the table, which seemed to thaw some of the ice. After dinner, when the dishes were cleared and the kids had retreated to the living room to watch a movie, I pulled Kevin and Samantha aside. I think it's time we had a real conversation, I said, gesturing for them to sit. Kevin leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. All right, let's talk. I know you're both worried about me, I began, and I understand why. But you need to trust me when I say that I'm not rushing into anything. Samantha folded her arms, her brow furrowed. Dad, we're just trying to look out for you. You've been through so much this year. We don't want you to make a decision you'll regret. This isn't about regret, I said firmly. This is about doing what feels right. Rebecca and the kids needed help, and I was in a position to give it. That's all there is to it. Kevin exchanged a glance with Samantha before speaking. It's not just about helping them, Dad. It's about you. Are you planning on making this permanent? The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for weeks until that moment. I care about Rebecca, I admitted, and I care about her kids, but I haven't made any decisions yet. Right now, I'm just taking it one day at a time. Kevin nodded slowly, his expression softening. All right, Dad, we just want you to be happy. I am happy, I said, happier than I've been in a long time. Samantha's face softened as well, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were finally on the same page. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. One evening, as I was finishing up paperwork in my office, Rebecca knocked on the door. She looked nervous, her hands twisting together as she stood in the doorway. Got a minute? She asked. Of course, I said, motioning for her to come in. She sat down across from me, her eyes darting around the room before finally meeting mine. I've been thinking, she began, about the future. I set my pen down, my attention fully on her. What about it? You've done so much for us, Matt. More than I could ever repay. And I don't want to take advantage of your kindness. You're not taking advantage, I said firmly. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. I think it might be time for us to move out. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What? Why? Because this isn't fair to you, she said, her voice trembling. You deserve more than to have us freeloading in your house. I've been saving up, and I think we can afford a small place. It won't be much, but— Rebecca, stop, I interrupted. You're not freeloading. You're part of this house now. You and the kids. This is your home. Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. Matt, I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, I said, my voice softening. You brought life back into this house. Don't you see that? She looked away, her shoulders trembling. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, I said. Just promise me you'll stay. At least for now. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. As the weeks passed, Rebecca seemed to relax, and the tension with Kevin and Samantha slowly eased. Rachel continued to visit often, and the house felt more alive than it had in years. But the question lingered in the back of my mind. Was this temporary, or was it the start of something permanent? On Christmas Eve, as we sat around the tree watching the kids open their presents, I couldn't help but feel a sense of completeness. Rebecca sat beside me, her hand brushing against mine as she laughed at something Molly said. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Rebecca and I sat in the living room, the glow of the Christmas lights casting a warm glow around the room. Matt, she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Yeah. She hesitated, then smiled. Thank you. For everything. You've given us more than I ever could have imagined. I reached over, taking her hand in mine. You've given me just as much, Rebecca. Maybe even more. The new year brought a sense of renewal to the house. Christmas had been a success, full of laughter, warmth, and something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. But life has a way of reminding you that nothing stays simple for long. Rebecca and I had fallen into an easy rhythm. Mornings were a whirlwind of getting the kids ready for school, packing lunches, and dodging Molly's never-ending questions about everything from why the sky is blue to whether Santa eats breakfast. In the evenings, Rebecca would cook dinner while I helped the boys with their homework. It felt like a family, something I hadn't dared to hope for after Emily's death. But as much as I wanted to move forward, the past had a way of creeping in. One morning, as Rebecca and I sat in the kitchen drinking coffee, Michael came bounding down the stairs with a piece of paper in his hand. "Uncle Matt," he exclaimed, holding it up. "Look what I drew." I took the paper and smiled. It was a crayon drawing of what I assumed was our house, complete with a stick figure version of me standing next to Michael, Mark, and Molly. "That's great, buddy," I said, ruffling his hair. "Look at the top," he said excitedly, pointing to the words scrawled in wobbly letters. "My family." The words hit me harder than I expected. For Michael to see me as part of his family, it was more than I could have asked for. Rebecca, sitting across the table, smiled softly. "That's beautiful, Michael. Why don't you put it on the fridge?" As Michael ran off to find a magnet, Rebecca met my gaze. "They love you, you know," she said quietly. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I love them too." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Kevin's car pulling into the driveway. I hadn't been expecting him, but over the past few weeks, he'd been making more of an effort to stop by. "Hey, Dad," Kevin said as he stepped into the kitchen. He glanced at Rebecca and offered a polite nod. "Morning, Rebecca." "Good morning, Kevin," she replied, her tone warm but reserved. "What brings you by?" I asked, gesturing for him to sit. Kevin hesitated, then sighed. "I wanted to talk to you about something. Privately." Rebecca stood, brushing off her hands. "I'll check on the kids," she said, giving me a reassuring smile before leaving the room. Once she was gone, Kevin leaned forward, his expression serious. "Dad, I know we've had our differences about Rebecca, and I'll admit, I've been judgmental. But seeing how happy you've been these past few months, I get it." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by his change in tone. "You do?" He nodded. "I may not fully understand your decision, but I can see how much it means to you. And if Rebecca and her kids make you happy, then I'll support you." I just needed some time to wrap my head around it. Relief washed over me, and I smiled. "Thanks, Kevin. That means a lot." "There's just one thing," he added, his tone cautious. "Here it comes," I muttered. Kevin chuckled. "I just want to make sure you're protecting yourself. Emotionally, financially, you know what I mean?" I met his gaze, my expression firm. "Kevin, I've been around long enough to know what I'm doing. I care about Rebecca and her kids, and they've become a part of my life. I'm not rushing into anything, but I'm not holding back either." Kevin nodded, his concern evident but tempered by understanding. "All right, Dad. Just know that we're here for you, no matter what." As he left, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time, it felt like my family was beginning to accept the changes in my life. The next few weeks brought more milestones. Molly started calling me Daddy without hesitation, and while Rebecca initially tried to correct her, I stopped her. "Let her call me what she wants," I said one evening as we sat together on the couch. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. "It's just, I don't want to confuse her." "She's not confused," I replied. "She knows exactly what she's saying." Rebecca's eyes softened, and she reached for my hand. "Thank you, Matt, for everything." Life wasn't perfect, of course. There were still challenges. Michael and Mark had trouble adjusting at school, and Rebecca was constantly worried about making ends meet. But we faced each hurdle together, and that made all the difference. Then came the night everything changed. It was a quiet evening. The kids were in bed, and Rebecca and I were sitting on the back porch, watching the stars. "Matt," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Yeah." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Always," I said, my chest tightening at the seriousness in her tone. "Where do you see this going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Us. The kids. This life we've built together. What does it mean to you?" I turned to her, searching her eyes for a moment before answering. "It means everything. You and the kids have become my family, Rebecca. I didn't think I'd find that again, but here we are." Tears filled her eyes, and she looked away. "I feel the same way, but I'm scared, Matt. Scared that this is all too good to be true." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. It's not too good to be true, Rebecca. It's real, and I wanted to stay that way. She smiled through her tears, her grip tightening on mine. I want that too, but it's a lot to ask, isn't it? Taking on me and the kids. It's not just a relationship. It's a whole life. I wouldn't want it any other way, I said firmly. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between us. Then, almost impulsively, I spoke the words that had been on the tip of my tongue for weeks. Rebecca, I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion. Will you marry me? Her eyes widened, and she stared at me in shock. Matt! I mean it, I said, leaning forward. I love you. I love the kids. And I don't want this to be temporary. I want us to be a family for real. Tears streamed down her face, and she shook her head, laughing softly. I don't know what to say. Say yes, I said, my heart pounding. She reached out, cupping my face in her hands. Yes, she whispered. Relief and joy washed over me, and I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as the weight of the past year finally began to lift. The engagement was met with mixed reactions. Rachel was thrilled, offering her full support and helping Rebecca plan a small wedding. Kevin and Samantha were more hesitant, but they eventually came around, realizing that this wasn't just a passing phase. For the first time in a long time, my life felt whole again. On the day of the wedding, as Rebecca walked down the aisle in a simple but elegant dress, I felt a surge of gratitude. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd been given, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. When we exchanged vows, I made a promise to Rebecca and the kids, to love them, to protect them, and to be the husband and father they deserved. And as we stood together, surrounded by family and friends, I knew I had finally found my way home. Marriage didn't magically solve every problem. I had known that going in, but reality has a way of teaching lessons no amount of preparation can. Rebecca and I were happy. That much was undeniable. But blending two lives, not to mention two families, wasn't without its hurdles. The first few weeks after the wedding were a whirlwind of adjustments. The kids were over the moon about the new arrangement. Molly took to calling me daddy full-time, a habit Rebecca had finally stopped trying to correct. Michael and Mark started introducing me to their friends as their father, a title that made me both proud and uneasy. Proud, because I loved them like they were my own. Uneasy because, deep down, I couldn't shake the nagging question. Was I really ready for this? The challenges weren't just internal. My kids, Kevin and Samantha in particular, were still struggling to accept the new dynamic. Rachel, bless her heart, had been nothing but supportive, but the tension with Kevin and Samantha lingered like a storm cloud, always threatening to rain on what should have been a joyful time. It all came to a head one evening during a family dinner. Rebecca had prepared a feast: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a peach cobbler for dessert. Kevin and Samantha had reluctantly agreed to come, and I had high hopes that the evening might finally bridge the gap between my old family and my new one. For a while, it seemed to be working. Kevin complimented Rebecca on the chicken, and Samantha even smiled at one of Molly's endless stories about kindergarten. But then Michael, in his innocent 8-year-old way, unknowingly dropped a bombshell. Uncle Matt, I mean Daddy, he corrected himself quickly, beaming with pride. Guess what I told my teacher today? I said you're the best dad ever. The room went silent. Rebecca's face flushed, and Kevin froze mid-bite. Samantha's fork clattered onto her plate, and her lips pressed into a thin line. That's nice, Michael, I said, trying to steer the moment back to safer waters. But Samantha wasn't letting it go. Do you think that's appropriate? She asked, her voice tight. Excuse me? Rebecca said, her tone calm but laced with warning. For him to call my dad Daddy, Samantha continued, her eyes fixed on Rebecca. It's a little much, don't you think? Samantha, I said sharply, but she ignored me. Look, I get it, she went on, her voice rising. You're married now. You're part of the family. But that doesn't mean my dad is suddenly their dad. They have a father. Or did you forget about him? Rebecca stiffened, her jaw tightening. I haven't forgotten, she said evenly. But my kids lost their father, and Matt has been more of a dad to them in the past year then. That's enough, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The table fell silent again, but the damage was done. After dinner, Kevin and Samantha left without so much as a goodbye. Rebecca tried to brush it off, but I could see the hurt in her eyes as she cleared the dishes. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, joining her at the sink. "It's not your fault," she replied, her voice trembling. "I knew this wouldn't be easy." "It's going to take time," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. She nodded, but the strain between us lingered for days. Despite the setbacks, life moved on. Rebecca and I focused on the kids, doing our best to create a stable, loving home. The boys started opening up more, sharing stories about their father and asking questions about what it meant to have a new one. Molly, blissfully unaware of the tension, continued to brighten every room she entered. One afternoon, as I was tinkering with the lawnmower in the garage, Michael wandered in. "Hey, buddy," I said, glancing up from the engine. "What's up? Can I ask you something?" he said, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Of course," I said, wiping my hands on a rag and sitting back. "Do you like being our dad?" The question caught me off guard. "What makes you ask that?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the floor. I don't want you to feel like you have to." I set the rag aside and pulled him into a hug. "Michael, listen to me. I love being your dad. You and Mark and Molly mean the world to me. Don't ever think otherwise, okay?" He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Okay." As he ran off to join his siblings, I couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude. Whatever challenges we faced, moments like that made it all worth it. But the peace didn't last. A few weeks later, Rebecca's past came back to haunt her. It started with a phone call. Rebecca answered, her face pale as she listened to whoever was on the other end. When she hung up, her hands were trembling. "Who was that?" I asked, concerned. "It was someone from my old life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't press her for details, but over the next few days, she seemed distant, lost in thought and jumpy at the slightest sound. Then, one evening, as we were sitting on the couch, she turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Matt, there's something I need to tell you," she said. I set my drink down, my heart sinking at her tone. "All right," I said carefully. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "Before I moved here, I was involved with someone who wasn't a good person." My stomach tightened, but I stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. "He was controlling," she said, her voice trembling. "And when I finally got the courage to leave, I thought I'd escaped. But now what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She met my gaze, her eyes filled with tears. "He's found me, and he wants to talk." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. "Does he know where you live?" I asked, my mind racing. She shook her head. "No, at least I don't think so. But he has my number, Matt. He could find me if he wanted to." Anger flared in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "We'll handle this," I said firmly. "You're not facing this alone." Rebecca nodded, her hands slipping into mine. But the fear in her eyes told me this was far from over. The days after filing the police report were tense. Rebecca still jumped at every sound, her nerves frayed from weeks of living in fear. I stayed vigilant, watching for any sign of the man who had dared to intrude on our lives. But as the weeks passed with no further incidents, a fragile sense of normalcy began to return. The kids went back to their routines, blissfully unaware of the storm that had nearly reached our door. Rebecca, though still cautious, started to let herself breathe again. I wanted to believe it was over, but deep down I knew better. The final confrontation came on a quiet Sunday evening. We just finished dinner, and Rebecca was upstairs getting Molly ready for bed while Michael and Mark played a board game in the living room. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. My heart sank. I dried my hands and walked to the front door, peering through the peephole. There he was, a tall man with a lean, wiry frame, standing beside an old, battered sedan. He looked rough around the edges, his posture radiating arrogance and menace. I opened the door, but didn't step outside. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my tone cold and measured. The man smirked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I'm here to see Rebecca. She doesn't want to see you," I said firmly. turn around, and leave. He chuckled, shaking his head. You must be mad. Heard a lot about you. Looks like Rebecca's traded up. Huh. The way he said her name sent a spike of anger through me, but I didn't let it show. Listen, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You've been told to stay away. If you don't leave right now, I'll make sure the police escort you out. His smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. You think you can just take what's mine? He snapped. She's not yours, I said, stepping closer. And if you ever come near her or the kids again, you'll regret it. He squared his shoulders, clearly not used to being challenged. For a moment, I thought he might take a swing at me, but then the sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the standoff. Matt! Rebecca's voice was filled with worry as she appeared behind me. The man's gaze shifted to her, and his expression softened slightly. Rebecca, he said, his tone almost pleading. Rebecca stepped forward, her hand tightening on my arm. Leave, Aaron, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I don't want anything to do with you. You don't mean that, he said, taking a step closer. We had something, Rebecca. You can't just erase that. I've moved on, she said firmly. You should too. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders sagged. You'll regret this, he muttered before turning and stalking back to his car. I waited until he was gone, his taillights disappearing into the night, before closing the door and locking it. Rebecca collapsed into my arms, her body trembling. Is it over? She whispered. Yes, I said, holding her tightly. It's over. The following morning, I called the police and reported the incident. They assured me they'd keep an eye on the area and encouraged Rebecca to file a restraining order. She agreed, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. Life gradually returned to normal. Rebecca and the kids began to settle into their routines again, and the shadow Aaron had cast over our lives slowly faded. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the kids play in the yard, Rebecca reached for my hand. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For everything, she said, her voice filled with emotion. For protecting us, for giving us a home, for being the man I never thought I'd find. I squeezed her hand, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. You've given me just as much, Rebecca, maybe even more. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the kids' laughter filling the air. As the months turned into years, the scars of the past began to heal. Rebecca and I built a life together, one filled with love, laughter, and the kind of chaos only a house full of kids can bring. Molly continued to call me Daddy, and it wasn't long before Michael and Mark followed suit. Eventually, we made it official. I adopted all three of them, cementing the bond we'd already formed. Kevin and Samantha, while initially hesitant, eventually came around. They saw how happy Rebecca made me and how much the kids had become a part of our family. By the time Rachel's next visit rolled around, it was as if Rebecca and the kids had always been part of the picture. I often thought about Emily during those quiet moments when the house was finally still. She would have loved Rebecca, I was sure of it, and I like to think she would have been proud of me for opening my heart again. Life hadn't turned out the way I'd planned, but as I watched my family grow and thrive, I realized it had turned out even better than I could have imagined.